In this episode, we're going to take the messy reality of security signals and turn it into something a human team can actually use. A coherent case that tells a clear story and deserves attention. Beginners often imagine security monitoring as a single alert that points directly to a problem, but most real environments produce thousands of small events that are only meaningful when you connect them. Correlation is the practice of linking related security events and threat information so the team sees a pattern rather than isolated noise. The result should be a case that explains what happened, what might be happening next, and why it matters, without requiring the analyst to manually stitch together dozens of separate breadcrumbs. When correlation is done well, response becomes faster because the team spends less time proving that something is related and more time deciding what to do about it. By the end, you should understand how correlation works at a high level, why it is difficult, and how it becomes the foundation for prioritizing the right work under pressure. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. When people hear the word correlate, they sometimes think it means finding perfect proof that two things are connected, but in security operations it usually means something more practical. Correlation is a disciplined way of building a plausible relationship between events based on shared context such as identity, device, time, data access, or network paths. A single event might be normal, but a sequence of events that fits a known attack path can become meaningful even if none of the individual events look dramatic on their own. This is why correlation is less about mathematics and more about storytelling with evidence, where the story is grounded in observable facts and tested by additional checks. Correlation also reduces wasted effort because it prevents analysts from chasing every alert as if it were isolated, which is one of the fastest ways to exhaust a team. Beginners should remember that attackers and failures rarely announce themselves with one perfect signal, and the organization cannot wait for perfect signals if it wants to contain harm quickly. Correlation is the method that turns scattered signals into something decision-ready. Before you can correlate effectively, you have to know what kinds of things you are correlating, because events and threat data are not the same kind of input even though they often appear side by side. Security events are observations from your environment, such as sign-ins, access requests, process activity, network connections, configuration changes, and unusual data operations. Threat data is information that helps you interpret what those events might mean, such as known techniques, common behaviors in active campaigns, and patterns that suggest certain kinds of misuse. Threat data can also include indicators, like suspicious network locations, but indicators are only one piece of the broader context. The goal is to combine what you see internally with what you know externally, so that your interpretation becomes sharper and your investigation path becomes shorter. A beginner-friendly way to think about it is that events tell you what happened in your world, while threat data helps you understand what similar patterns have meant in other worlds. When you blend them carefully, you get faster recognition of meaningful situations and fewer false assumptions. A major reason correlation is challenging is that raw events are often inconsistent, incomplete, and noisy, which means the first step is usually normalization rather than correlation. Normalization is the process of translating different event formats into a consistent internal shape so you can compare and connect them reliably. One system might record an identity as an email address, another might record it as a numeric identifier, and a third might record it as a display name. And without normalization, these could look like three different people. One system might record time in a different time zone, another might have clock drift, and a third might record only the date. And without normalization, your timeline becomes unreliable. Even basic fields like source device, destination service, and action type can be labeled differently across systems, making simple comparisons hard. Normalization is not glamorous, but it is what makes correlation defensible, because it reduces the chance that you connect the wrong things together or miss the connection entirely. Beginners should see normalization as the step that turns raw data into usable evidence. Once normalization is in place, correlation often begins with something called entity resolution, which is a fancy way of saying you decide whether different events refer to the same person, system, application, or dataset. This matters because cases are usually built around entities, such as a user account behaving strangely, a server showing unusual network behavior, or a dataset being accessed in an unexpected way. Entity resolution is difficult because entities can change names, devices can be reassigned, and service accounts can behave in ways that do not match human patterns. If you get entity resolution wrong, you can either connect unrelated events and create a false case, or fail to connect related events and miss a real incident path. A careful approach uses multiple attributes, such as identity plus device plus time plus resource, rather than relying on one field alone. It also treats uncertain matches as lower confidence, because forcing certainty too early can mislead the investigation. For beginners, the key lesson is that accurate correlation depends on being sure you are talking about the same thing across multiple systems. Time is another core ingredient, because most meaningful security stories are sequences, and sequences depend on knowing what happened first and what happened next. Correlation therefore relies on time windows, which are defined periods used to connect events that occur close enough together to plausibly be related. If the time window is too wide, you connect unrelated events and create noise. But if the window is too narrow, you miss slow-moving attacks and long-running misuse. The right window often depends on the scenario, because credential misuse might unfold quickly, while data staging might unfold over hours or days. Time windows also need to account for operational realities, such as batch jobs, scheduled maintenance, and routine business peaks, so you do not misinterpret legitimate bursts as suspicious sequences. Beginners sometimes assume the best window is always the smallest one, but small windows can miss meaningful patterns that develop slowly, especially in patient, low-noise attacks. A mature correlation process chooses windows that match the event path being tested and adjusts them as evidence and confidence evolve. Correlation methods often fall into two broad styles that beginners should understand, because the style influences what kinds of cases you will find. One style is rule-based correlation, where you define patterns that, when seen together, produce a case, such as a risky sign-in followed by access to sensitive data followed by unusual network activity. Rule-based methods can be reliable when the pattern is well understood, but they can also be brittle if the environment changes or if attackers vary their steps. The other style is anomaly and behavior-based correlation, where you look for deviations from baseline across multiple signals and connect them into a coherent story, such as unusual access combined with unusual communication combined with unusual timing. Behavior-based correlation can be more adaptive, but it can also produce noise if baselines are weak or if context is missing. In practice, strong operations often use both styles, because rules catch known patterns and behavior analysis catches new or subtle patterns. For beginners, what matters is not choosing a favorite style, but understanding that correlation is a way of linking signals into a story that can be tested, regardless of whether the first link came from a rule or a baseline deviation. Threat data becomes most useful during correlation when it helps you decide which relationships are meaningful and which are likely coincidences. If external intelligence suggests that a certain technique often involves unusual account behavior followed by lateral movement, you can treat that sequence as a more meaningful hypothesis when you see early signs of it internally. If intelligence suggests that certain services are being targeted in your sector, you can treat anomalies around those services as higher priority, because the probability of real threat pressure is higher. Threat data can also help you avoid overreacting to a single indicator, because it can provide broader context about whether the indicator is strongly linked to malicious behavior or is commonly seen in benign activity. A common beginner mistake is to treat threat intelligence as a list of scary facts that overrides internal reality, but the stronger approach treats it as a lens that sharpens interpretation. When threat data is used wisely, it increases confidence in cases that align with active patterns and reduces effort spent on patterns that are unlikely to matter. Correlation is where threat data stops being a passive report and becomes a living part of operational decision-making. As cases start to form, context enrichment becomes the next step, because a case that lacks context is just a bundle of events, not a decision-ready narrative. Enrichment means adding information that explains what the entities are, why they matter, and what normal would look like for them, so the team can judge severity and urgency. For a user account, enrichment includes role, privilege level, typical access patterns, and whether the account is used by a person or automation. For a system, enrichment includes criticality, data sensitivity, exposure level, and dependencies that might cause cascade impact. For a dataset, enrichment includes classification, normal access roles, and business processes that depend on its integrity and confidentiality. Enrichment also includes recent change history, because changes often explain anomalies and also create windows of vulnerability. Beginners should recognize that enrichment is not about collecting trivia. It is about adding the minimum context needed to decide whether the case is worth escalating, worth investigating further, or safe to close. Once you have correlated and enriched a case, you still need to prioritize it, because not every coherent story deserves the same level of attention. Prioritization is where security operations become realistic about limited time and limited staff, and it is also where mistakes can be costly. A good prioritization approach separates severity from confidence, because a high-impact scenario might require fast action even when evidence is still developing, while a low-impact scenario might be handled calmly even when evidence is strong. Severity is shaped by the potential outcomes, such as sensitive data exposure, critical service disruption, or integrity loss in important records. Confidence is shaped by the quality and number of correlated signals, the strength of entity resolution, and how well the case matches known patterns from threat data and internal baselines. Prioritization also considers speed, meaning whether the suspected scenario could escalate quickly, such as ransomware deployment or privilege escalation. Beginners should learn that prioritization is not a popularity contest among alerts. It is a disciplined choice about where attention reduces the most risk. One of the most important guardrails in correlation and prioritization is managing false positives and false negatives in a way that improves the system instead of blaming people. A false positive case is one that looks coherent but is actually benign, and too many false positives waste time and erode trust in the correlation process. A false negative is when signals that should have formed a case did not, and that can allow incidents to grow unnoticed. Correlation quality improves when the team treats every closed case as feedback, asking which assumptions were wrong, which context was missing, and which correlation rule or baseline interpretation needs tuning. It also improves when the team treats missed incidents as learning opportunities, identifying what visibility gaps existed and what correlation relationships should be strengthened. Beginners sometimes think good analysts never make mistakes, but the reality is that good operations are built on continuous refinement. The goal is to reduce uncertainty and improve signal quality over time, not to pretend that every early interpretation is perfect. When this learning loop exists, the correlation system becomes quieter, sharper, and more defensible. Case management is where correlated data becomes operational work, because a case must be recorded, updated, and handed off cleanly if it will lead to effective response. A case record should explain the correlated signals, the timeline, the entities involved, the hypothesized event path, and the current confidence and severity judgments. It should also document decisions, such as why the case was escalated, what containment steps were taken, or why it was closed as benign, because these decisions will be questioned later during reviews. A strong case record also preserves links back to the original events and the context used for enrichment, because traceability is part of defensibility. If a case crosses shifts or involves multiple teams, the case record becomes the shared memory that prevents confusion and duplicated work. Beginners should remember that correlation without case discipline becomes a fleeting insight that disappears, while correlation with strong case records becomes organizational knowledge. This is how security operations become repeatable rather than heroic. Correlation also needs to connect to response playbooks, because the whole point of building a coherent case is to enable faster, more consistent action. If the case suggests credential misuse, the playbook should guide actions that reduce further misuse while preserving evidence, such as checking scope of access and limiting sessions appropriately. If the case suggests lateral movement, the playbook should guide actions that contain spread and identify what other systems might be affected based on the correlated path. If the case suggests data misuse, the playbook should guide actions that protect the dataset and clarify potential exposure and integrity impact without speculation. The playbook connection also helps analysts avoid freezing under uncertainty because it provides default decision points and evidence checks. Beginners should see that playbooks are not rigid scripts that replace thinking, but structured guides that reduce the chance of missing critical steps. When correlation output is aligned with playbooks, the organization moves with momentum rather than confusion, which is exactly what improves response speed and accuracy. Reporting is another place where correlation matters, because decision-makers do not want to hear about thousands of events. They want to hear about a small number of meaningful cases. A well-correlated case can be communicated in a way that leaders and system owners understand, because it is a narrative tied to outcomes rather than a pile of technical artifacts. Reporting should explain what happened, what might be happening, what the potential impact is, what the current confidence is, and what actions are underway or required. It should also show how the case fits into broader patterns, such as repeated identity misuse attempts or repeated availability disruptions, because patterns inform investment decisions. Correlation improves reporting credibility because it shows that the organization is not reacting to random noise, but is tracking coherent sequences that match plausible risk paths. Beginners should learn that reporting is part of operations, not a separate activity, because good reporting influences the resources and authority the team will have during the next incident. When leaders trust the case narrative, they act faster and with less debate. It is also important to understand that correlation can create risk if it becomes a black box that nobody can explain. If the team cannot explain why a case exists or why it was prioritized, stakeholders will either ignore it or argue about it, and both outcomes slow response. Defensibility requires that correlation logic is explainable in plain language, at least at the level of what signals were connected and what hypothesis they support. It also requires that assumptions are visible, such as uncertain entity matches or incomplete context, because hidden assumptions can lead to false confidence. A transparent correlation process makes it easier to tune, because people can see which link in the chain produces noise and which link is valuable. Beginners should see explainability as a core requirement, not a luxury, because security operations involve real-world decisions with real-world consequences. When correlation is explainable, it becomes trustworthy, and trust is what allows the organization to act decisively under pressure. Finally, correlation must evolve as the organization changes, because the environment is not static and the threat landscape is not static. New services appear, old services change roles, data moves to new places, and user workflows shift, and each shift can change what normal looks like and what meaningful patterns look like. Threat patterns also evolve, and correlation rules that once captured common paths may become less effective or may produce more noise if attackers change techniques. A disciplined program revisits correlation logic, enrichment data, and prioritization thresholds based on case outcomes, near misses, and real incidents. It also revisits coverage, because correlation can only connect what it can see, and visibility gaps can produce dangerous blind spots. Beginners should remember that correlation is not a one-time setup. It is an operating capability that improves through feedback and deliberate refinement. When that refinement is steady, the organization becomes better at turning early signals into timely, proportionate action. To conclude, correlating security events and threat data into coherent, prioritized cases is the practice of turning scattered observations into narratives that support fast, accurate decision-making. The work begins with normalization and entity resolution so events can be connected reliably, then uses time windows, rule and behavior relationships, and threat context to build plausible event paths. Enrichment adds the organizational context that makes a case meaningful, while prioritization separates severity from confidence so the team can act proportionately under uncertainty. Strong case management preserves traceability and supports handoffs, and alignment with playbooks turns correlated stories into consistent actions that reduce harm. Over time, careful handling of false positives and false negatives improves correlation quality, and explainable logic builds trust with stakeholders who must make hard decisions quickly. If you can take a noisy stream of events, connect the right ones into a clear story, and prioritize that story based on impact and evidence. You have learned one of the most practical skills in security operations, making the signal coherent enough to act on when time matters.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.